kind of expand from there. They sort of reverted back, right, under non-emergency conditions to what was prototypically the 19th century understanding of presidential power. So if that's the case, how do we go from that conception to what we have today? Well, it really didn't start with the presidency. And you would think it would, but it didn't. It actually started with something broader, and that was the economy. The transformation of the United States because of industrialization, new technologies, the railroad, had had a profound effect on governance. So what I mean by this is, in the 1800s, early 1800s, Congress could usually deal with public policy problems, particularly with the economy, by issuing a law. So for instance, this is actually a real case. There needed to be commerce and transport between Boston and New York. Congress solved this through explicit legislation, authorizing the creation of the post road, authorizing money, appropriating money, and got the road, right? The complexities of industrialization. It meant that this kind of slow and arduous process needed something different. And that something came in the form of regulatory agencies. So you have, born in the late 1800s, 1887 to be exact, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, which regulated commerce. So Congress began to delegate authority, create agencies and departments to delegate policy-making authority, discretionary policy-making authority to the executive branch. Again, not to the president, to these executive branch entities. And everybody thinks, well, that's the president. No, it's not at this time. The idea of the unitary executive, the idea that somehow there's top-down management control of the entire executive branch was foreign to the 19th century, certainly the people in the executive branch and certainly the people in Congress. So that's the slow evolution that you see. The presidency doesn't really come into being or part of this game until the start of the 20th century. So you have the progressive era going on for about 10, 15 years. And the progressive era is an answer to this changing economy, right? New ideas, exploration around science, right? Human beings, and of course, government, what it can do, what it can't do. The presidency, under this 19th century norm, was confined, right, to what's explicitly or what could be reasonably conferred through the Constitution and laws. And if that's the case, it could not kind of join this party, at least take out presidential powers for a spin. So you had Theodore Roosevelt, start of the 20th century, who had to come up with a better rationale for the president to expand powers. And what he did, as opposed to saying, I'm going to get my powers expressly from the Constitution, I'm going to do what I believe is in the public interest, whatever that is. As long as the Constitution or laws say that it's not prohibited, that it's not prohibited by the Constitution or laws, I can do it. This opens up wide-ranging possibilities of what presidents could do. And it's not as if presidents took this out for a spin and did extraordinary things right away. They did very small things. So I'll just give you an example here. Presidents early on under this conception, there was a federal law that authorized the selling of Western land, right? We had a ton of Western land owned by the federal government. The federal law mandated the Interior Department to set market rates for the land and then to sell it. And that's all it did. Well, you had individuals and companies start buying up here and there. What was found on this federal land? Minerals and oil. What that did is it drove up the prices for the federal land still for sale, which meant that the federal government was only going to get pennies on the dollar for this because the market conditions were set before the discovery of oil, let's say. This became the Supreme Court case, went all the way to the Supreme Court because one of the companies said, looking at the law, said, look, the president doesn't have authority. What the president actually did was he removed from the marketplace this federal land to get reassessed based on the idea that, right, those oil being discovered, so the prices went up. But again, this was not expressly in law. So it went all the way Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's right. The law doesn't expressly allow the president to do this, to withdraw the land to get reassessed and then put it back on the market. But we're going to go ahead and allow for this. The reason is because presidents have been doing this for a while, and the acquiescence of Congress, it's built into it. Congress did not oppose through affirmative legislative action. So this is a famous Supreme Court case early on. The reason I mention this is because this is a conversation and a journey, not just with the presidency and Congress. The courts have a strong voice in the evolution here. And here's an example of the president, through unilateral action, expanding power, and the courts reinforcing that power. Now, where you really see the acceleration of this conception, and again, this is through unilateral action up until this point, right? The reconceptualization of presidential power under Teddy Roosevelt, where you really see the acceleration is World War I. But before I talk about World War I want to mention the 16th Amendment. And the 16th Amendment is profound when it comes to not only taxes, but tariffs. Okay, so traditionally, tariffs are justified from this point all the way back to when the United States started for two reasons, one of two reasons. One is a revenue measure, right? So the federal government has to get money somehow. The primary way it got money for most of its history all the way up until here, which is about the 19-teens, is through issuing tariffs to collect money. The other justification is to protect industries, right? So revenue and protectionism. How does a tariff protect industries? Just very quickly, you have an import coming in. This import is, let's say, flooding the market and making the good cheaper, which makes it difficult for a U.S. industry to stay in business. U.S. puts a tariff on it and thus gives opportunity, at least the concept goes, to allow for this U.S. industry to strengthen and grow. That's protectionism in the concept. And both were employed in the 19th century at various times. We know that, probably you all have heard about the McKinley tariffs. You have in the 1830s the tariffs of abominations. They were called that because they were protecting northern interests, and the southern states hated them because of that. Southern states were mainly agriculture. They were getting most of their equipment and everything from overseas in Europe, putting up tariffs and driving up costs. So you have these examples, and I'll talk more about protectionism tariffs later, but this was a sea change because the 16th Amendment passed in 1913, constitutionally sanctioned, allowed for Congress to issue income taxes. Before this time, the federal court said Congress doesn't have the power to issue an income tax. So the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913, and shortly after that, Congress imposed an income tax. A few years later, only took a few years, actually 1917 to be exact, the income tax revenue outgained revenue coming from tariffs. And we never looked back from there. And so what the 16th Amendment did is it really did displace as a rationale for using tariffs, revenue collection. So let's talk a little bit about World War I and how significant that is, because a lot of people think of the rise of presidential power coming from the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. That's not the case. The framework and template for what happened in the New Deal, what happened in World War I or II, happens because of Woodrow Wilson, this gentleman right here, in Congress. Woodrow Wilson was a presidential and congressional scholar. Probably one of the smartest individuals to ever be in the White House. Also one of the most racist modern presidents. But for the purposes of what we're discussing, his knowledge of Congress, his knowledge of the presidency, he understood with the incoming World War I what he would need to do in terms of expanding presidential power. He couldn't justify it, not the leaps and bounds that he would need to expand presidential power by going the Teddy Roosevelt model. that would be too politically risky and it would be too legally risky. So he actually just went to Congress. He wined and dined members of Congress, and members in the Congress authorized 22 separate acts, right, legislative acts, delegating extraordinary powers to the president, sweeping, mind-boggling if you think about it, up until, from George Washington up until then, what kind of powers were delegated. For the first time in U.S. history, a president could reconstruct, restructure the executive branch, change departments and agencies around. This was a unilateral authority given to Wilson. Why? It's a time of emergency. Another one, the Trading with Enemy Act, gave the president extraordinary powers around communications, migration, trade, commerce. Okay? So these are just two of them. But the Trading with Enemy Act, like a lot of the other emergency legislation, had no sunset provision. So they were created during an emergency, but they did not sunset. They did not end at the stop of World War I. And this becomes big a little bit later. So, does anybody know who this is? Johnson? Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, yes. So Roosevelt, a few years later, comes into the White House, and he points to the Trading with Enemy Act as justification for declaring a bank holiday. So the bank holiday was a measure that was needed because there was a run on banks. If anybody's seen It's a Wonderful Life, you'll know this scene where people are coming into the bank and trying to withdraw their deposits. And the reason for that is the banks were going under. And this was before federal insurance, right? And as a result, people were coming in and withdrawing deposits, which meant the banks were starting to go under. And Roosevelt froze, right? Basically froze the whole situation. It's called a national holiday. Banks went right away, right? They closed up shop for a while. This was so legally dubious because nothing in the Trading with Enemy Act explicitly gives the president such authority that when Congress came back in session, it post-ratified Roosevelt's action through this Emergency Banking Relief Act. Among other things it did for purposes of this discussion, it was ratifying its action as it relates to the Trading with Enemy Act. Now, this set a precedent, right, of expanding presidential power using, we'll use vague language, whatever, but we're going to throw whatever out there, see what sticks. Other presidents after Roosevelt, every single one up till Ford, and I'll talk a little bit later why Ford's the last one, would use the Trading with Enemy Act, not only during times of war and emergency, but in peacetime. All right? And again, it gets into the conception of presidential power and how it's expanding. Now, the importance of World War I. It certainly is important, the delegation of emergency power. But more importantly, it's the cultural shift in governance. Up until this time, Congress is driving the bus, right? We're talking all the way back to 1789, all the way to really the 19-teens. Congress is driving the bus. The president is in the way back seat. They're not even giving the president the car keys to even possibly drive the bus, right? This changes, and Congress is beginning to delegate explicitly to the president. You didn't have that before, even during the rise of industrialization and what we saw in terms of the modern administrative state. They were creating independent regulatory agencies, which were independent from the president. They were creating policy independent of the president. Here, they're giving president powers, and they are starting to defer and seeing the presidency as an institution that can get things done. This is well before the New Deal. And this is important. It's an important building block. And I promise you, I'm getting to tariffs. A main example that signifies this during this period more than anything else is the Banking and Accounting Act. Now, I couldn't find the actual law itself, so I just did a congressional report. This national budget system is one of the reports Congress issued. Basically, they were having problems with the federal budget. As the modern administrative state grew, there were way too many departments and agencies submitting budget proposals each year to Congress. It was bonkers, nonsense, right? They couldn't make heads or tails. So they're like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to give this policy problem to the president to fix. So they laid in the Banking and Accounting Act of 1921 at the feet of the president the agenda setting ability around the budget, meaning they required the budget, required the president to submit an annual budget to Congress. This is a tremendously impactful. You would not have had a decade before, 20 years before. Congress would have laughed you out if you proposed this 20 years before. But 1921, it's the time. And this really does reflect the great change in governing norms, right? Where they're not as fearful, there's not an antagonistic relationship with the president. So now, as I promised you, let's talk a little bit about tariffs. So this shift, governing shift, is slowly happening, right? For the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century. The pivot point when it comes to Congress ceding and pushing to the president, I wouldn't say control, but management authority over trade and tariffs, really starts with the Tariff Act of 1930, popularly known as the Smoot-Hawley Act. And in the late 1920s, we had a Great Depression. So we had an economic calamity. And like other economic calamities in the past, one of the tools in the policy tool chest was tariffs, protectionist tariffs. And Congress, in its great wisdom, said, hey, you know what? I'm going to take this tariff power out for a spin. And this is going to get us out of the Great Depression. And so they proposed a bill, and against the great advice of economists, right, and there was 1,000 of them that petitioned President Hoover for spin. And this is going to get us out of the Great Depression. And so they proposed a bill, and against the great advice of economists, right, and there was 1,000 of them that petitioned President Hoover. Economists at this time, or economic thought, was kind of coalescing around, tariffs, they could possibly be a top policy solution here. No, what you really should start doing is reducing trade barriers, and doing so strategically. Congress ignored that. They went to the economists, they went to the president. Hoover ignored it, signed the bill, Smoot-Hawley. It was wonderfully successful? No. It had profound economic policy consequences. You can see this cartoon here. Honestly, I don't know if it's a donkey or horse, whatever it is. It's a big old animal. It represents the Smoot-Hawley bill. It looks like it's eating the farmer. The tariffs were supposed to protect various U.S. industry, agriculture being one of them. You have this donkey horse thing eating the farmer, not a good thing. That's the consequence, policy consequence. And this has two results. First and foremost, it sort of turns Congress off. This is the last time Congress will issue a tariff, particularly a tariff for protectionist measures. So as it turns Congress off from using its Article 1 tariff authority, and it also turns members of Congress off from thinking of equating tariffs to protectionism being inherently good, right? That's the significant consequence there. As a result of this, only a few short years, we're talking, right, this is happening in early 1930s, Roosevelt comes into office a couple years later. You have a receptive president in Roosevelt, a receptive Congress. So the economists are whispering sweet nothings in the policymakers' ears, and they're whispering sweet nothings around reduced trade barriers, right? Start engaging strategically with foreign countries to be able to find open markets right out of, right? And Congress is like, okay, let's do that. So they set in law this Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. They set set in law, the policy-making goal. They tell the executive branch, start going out to other countries, negotiating trade deals to reduce trade barriers. So this becomes the U.S. policy starting in the early 1930s. We flip in the matter of about 5 years from relatively protectionist policy to deal with economic calamity to really what is, in essence, the start of a free market kind of approach, or freer market. And this is significant. I can't think of an example of such a profound snap of the finger policy flip, right? So this happens, and we set the United States on this trajectory, and international agreements are the tool, right? And all international agreements are is our government talks to another government and they come up with kind of a general agreement on specifics around what trade barriers they want to reduce. We sign it and we see how it goes. It's not a treaty. Treaties need the ratification of the Senate. This doesn't, as long as it doesn't affect law, you can sign international agreements. Though most international agreements, trade agreements, do need implementation legislation. I'll get to that a little bit later. But over the course of the next 10 years, right, starting in 1934, the executive branch will sign 32 of these. This Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act is policy very successful. It opens up markets, freer markets for U.S. goods. It's politically successful. So much so that it really sets the path when it comes to U.S. foreign policy from really here on out till today, with some exceptions. Now, actually, before I go on, let me mention one thing here. During this time in the 1930s, there was actually a controversy that went all the way to Supreme Court, and it dealt with a congressional policy. Congress had set an embargo on a few foreign countries. This embargo ticked off some exporter companies. One, Curtis Wright was its name, Curtis Wright Company, exporter company. And basically Curtis Wright argued that what Congress did was against the law and unconstitutional. Went all the way to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no. Congress has the Article 1 power over the Commerce Clause, yada yada. That isn't the importance of this story. What's important here is the Supreme Court in dicta. And what dicta is, it's extra language in a court opinion that doesn't deal directly with the controversy at hand. It's irrelevant kind of language. Well, the Supreme Court goes off in what is a case dealing with congressional power to say, hey, the president is the top dog in foreign policy, is the sole organ of the United States, the sole voice in foreign policy. This is called the sole organ doctrine. Again, this case is United States versus Curtis Wright. This sole organ doctrine will be taken out for a spin with every subsequent president. And the reason this is so significant is it expands presidential power in a variety of ways in foreign affairs that were even unimaginable back in the mid-20th century. And so to the point where you have in court filings today, the Trump administration using Curtis Wright and the sole organ doctrine to claim that, you know what, I'm the sole organ, the presidency, the executive branch of foreign affairs, the courts, the Congress, you all can't get involved in deportations. This is ridiculous. I control the foreign policy, not you all. And again, this is an example of where presidential power is expanded either through delegation or unilateral action, and the courts time and time again come back and reinforce that power, right? So as I mentioned, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was widely successful. During that 10-year period, as I mentioned, 32 agreements. We have during this period as well the World War. World War sort of, not a hiccup, but it was a little bit of a road bump in U.S. plans. But U.S. used the aftermath of of World War II to begin to look bigger, right? The U.S. policy beginning in the early 30s was around freer trade, right? Reducing trade barriers. The U.S. wanted to go bigger after the World War II. What they wanted is an international structure set up in order to promote free trade, if you will. And so the U.S. began, after World War II ended, to start holding conferences and negotiating, right? And they ultimately accumulated into this GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And GATT is the North Star going forward. It's basically the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, but for the international stage. So we have a bunch of our own allies, if you will, coming together to sign this agreement. And what was our North Star starting in the 1930s becomes their North Star. So it's a reduction of tariffs, it's a reduction of trade barriers, and that becomes the mantra, right, of the U.S. and its allies. Now, this North Star is built on several pillars. And I mentioned some of them already, right? Starting in the early 20th century, one of those pillars was the governing or cultural change, right? Where Congress was driving the bus, and now Congress is kind of giving the keys over, expansion of presidential power. Obviously, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act explicitly did that when it comes to policy making, but it did defer to Congress. I shouldn't say defer, it did delegate that law, 1934 law, did delegate to the president the ability to adjust tariff rates down. So it was part of the reason why we were able to get some of these international trade agreements done. There's some other things that affected this period, this post-World War II consensus. As I mentioned, economists, whispering sweet nothings in policymakers' ears around reducing trade barriers. So the secondary effect was, right, delegating the power to the presidency and giving the presidency more power. The economists didn't care about that. Though you had other academics who did. Post-World War II academics began to, in their academic writings, began to champion and cheerlead presidential power. If there was a public policy problem, give the president more power. We want to tackle communism, enlarge the powers of the presidency. We want to deal with trade, right? Give the presidency more power. I'm simplifying it a bit, but this is basically what you saw, and you might be thinking, well, they're academics, nobody reads their writings, right? Which probably is true, I hate to say, but these academics, the Clinton Rossiters, the Richard Neustadts, the Arthur Schlesingers, Neustadt worked in Truman's administration. Schlesinger was good friends with the Kennedys. Henry Kissinger, and a well-known academic, he was National Security Advisor, and then became Secretary of State. So these people were going in and out of administration. So almost in an incestuous way that way. So they became important thought leaders, not only in academia teaching the next generation, but important thought leaders when it comes to how government is operating. And then they would also testify in front of Congress. So anytime Congress is like, well, what about trade policy, or what about this presidential power? Well, you would have a Neustadt type sitting there and saying, you know what, this is fine, we can go in this direction. And it was almost a uniform construct and change in higher education in this regard. So this was kind of a pillar promoting, right, and going in this direction to this post-World War II consensus, where really the president, through the delegated power, is leading on when it comes to trade policy and tariffs. But even under the GATT system, in the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, despite the fact that the president's able to negotiate international trade agreements, the president doesn't have the tariff authority that modern presidents do. And this became a problem. And as a result of this, President Kennedy was able to convince Congress in the early 60s to pass the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. What did the Trade Expansion Act do? It did a few things, but the most important for this conversation is it provided the president the authority to issue tariffs. If there was a threat to national security, imports were going to threaten national security, the president could issue a tariff. If the imports were going to cause serious economic harm, the president could issue a tariff. Before this, as I said, under the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, the president could adjust, but didn't have that stick like this. And a lot of presidents, not just Trump, would use this authority. So Trump has most recently used this. Does everybody know that Trump issued an automobile tariff? There's so many tariffs that my head spins. But that automobile tariff is based on the Trade Expansion Act as a national security threat. The other most significant piece of legislation during this time, and context matters, the Trade Act of 1974 happens in the aftermath of Watergate and Nixon. And everybody knows Congress after Watergate and Nixon was a bit ornery, right? It passed the War Powers Resolution, not omnibus, the Budget Impoundment Control Act, a number of other measures. It passed the Trade Act. In the Trade Act, unlike a lot of its predecessors in terms of tariff trade authority delegation, it had a number of checks in it. One of the checks was to require the publication of international trade agreements. You would think by the 1970s, or well before the 1970s, these international trade agreements would be published, right? There would be full transparency. They weren't. A lot of them weren't known. So Congress required them to be published in the Federal Register. I kid you not. This was, by the way, this was not only going on with trade agreements, but other things as well, like we can talk about later. So transparency is one. You have to know what's going on in order to be able to counter the power or to figure out the public policy. Another one, and I find this humorous, Congress created an advisory committee around trade. And the reason they did this is because the executive branch was going out and talking to foreign countries, right, and coming up and reducing trade barriers. And a lot of times they weren't talking to the U.S. private sector that it was affecting. Heck, the executive branch, the State Department, wasn't talking to the very executive departments that oversaw the policy area. So if, let's say, a trade agreement was dealing with agriculture subsidies or something like that, they might not be talking to the agriculture department. So this advisory committee required the private sector and government, right, to be part of the table. I find that, I shouldn't be surprised considering the executive branch isn't a hierarchical structure. It's much more egalitarian even today than what people conceptualize. So that was another check. Other checks in there was sunset provisions, so cutting off the authorization of various authorities after a certain number of years. That was put in there. But the big thing when it comes to delegation in the Trade Act are two. One, it's another round of tariff authorities that Congress authorized. So for instance, if there was unfair trade practices happening in the foreign country, not Congress, the president could authorize a new tariff. If there was a surge in imports, this is another, the surge of imports authority, the president could issue a new tariff. So that gave the president 4 unique ways to issue tariffs in these 2 laws. The big one was around fast-track trade authority. This is the first time in '74 that Congress authorizes the president to have fast-track trade authority. Now, this is getting a bit into the weeds, but why is this important? We need to step back and understand what trade agreements are. Trade agreements aren't just about tariffs. They could be, right? You know, I'm in the United States, I'm working with Argentina or whoever, and I want to reduce tariffs. I can do it as president, I'm going to have you do it. We're all fine and good, call it, right? Wipe our hands, we sign the deal, and that's it. But trade barriers are complex. They're more than just tariffs. They could relate to subsidies. They could relate to quality control standards on products. So any number of things. And they're not a one-for-one trade agreements. It's not as if the U.S. says we're reducing our subsidies, you reduce your subsidies, or I'm going to reduce my tariff rates, you reduce yours. It's usually a mishmash of any number of things. And the complexity, but also the nature of them being anything, everything and tariffs, means that most of the time these trade agreements require Congress to act, meaning there needs to be implementation legislation after a trade agreement is signed. So let's say I'm president, I sign a trade agreement in 1960. It might not be until 1962, 2 years later, before Congress gets around to ratifying, right? And in doing so, Congress can take the trade agreement and they can offer amendments, right? And you could have any number of things changed, right? So you had the the U.S. and the foreign country signing this agreement in 1960, and by 1962, after Congress is done with it, 50% of it could look fundamentally different. And this happened, and as a result of this, the executive branch and Congress got together, and they came up with fast-track trade authority, which meant basically that the elongated timeline was done away with. Instead of it taking maybe a year, a couple of years, it took a matter of a couple months. So the necessary policy that needed to be enacted by Congress was put on a timetable, right? You also got rid of the filibuster. So any supermajoritarian rules, everything was a majority up or down vote. In exchange, and that's fundamentally what it did for the executive branch. In exchange, Congress got to be involved at the negotiating stage. Statutorily, it requires certain congressional committees to be involved, to be informed, not only the committee members, but committee staff. Fast-track trade authority lasted from relatively unbroken from 1974. Does anybody know if it still is around? It's not around. It sunset in 2021. So, and that's because it's part of that, right? After a few short years, it can, it has to be reauthorized, and Congress in 2021 or 2020, I should say, decided not to reauthorize. Yes.
I was going to ask about GATT, because I remember GATT was a big deal in negotiations around NAFTA. I remember it was one of NAFTA, WTO, GATT.
Yeah.
Protest about WTO.
Yeah, and
I
GATT
remember in
turned into
1999, there was a huge protest in Seattle, Washington. I think GATT was, I haven't heard anything about GATT. Is GATT gone?
GATT got replaced by WTO. So WTO in the mid-1990s replaced it. And basically, because of a lot of criticisms with GATT. And that cartoon right here, that this really gets the criticism. What was called then third world country. But basically GATT was preferencing countries in the northern hemisphere, and it was disadvantaging, right? And so GATT changed in the WTO, and it set a new policy direction by trying to protect these countries that were being harmed by GATT. But yeah, low tariffs in GATT itself as an economic pursuit was generally a economic good for the United States. And that actually gets into my next pillar, which is the reason the post-World War II consensus worked more than anything else is because the U.S. was a superpower. The U.S. was the world's biggest and strongest economy. So even if these trade deals, right, even if there was adjustments being made that hurt U.S. economy, right, industries, it would hurt the overall U.S. economy on the margins. It would be almost like white noise. It's like the rising tide rises all ships. Well, even if a ship's going down, it doesn't matter. And this has profound implications when it comes to the politics of it. Because the U.S. economy was such a roaring tiger, there was no political opposition of note that could attach itself to the political center. So the average voting lawmaker in Congress was a free trader, was pro-tariffs in terms of not being protectionist and reducing them, right? And this all fit within this post-World War II era. And certainly presidential candidates Republican or Democrat, no candidate and certainly no president was anything but a free trader or against this kind of post-World War II order. And in effect, as I say here, because of all this, there is no daylight between the Democrats and Republicans. So it doesn't matter if you have JFK in the White House. It doesn't matter if you have Dwight Eisenhower. They're all pretty much in that sweet spot of freer trade, using international trade agreements. There's nothing. Now, that doesn't say both Republican and Democratic parties are big tent political parties at this time, right? They have conservatives, they have liberals, both of them. They have isolationist elements, they have elements that believe in protectionism. I mean, the Democrats with unions are a big example of this. But to get into the political center, which for me means getting bills passed in Congress and getting the presidency, no, they're on the margins. They don't have the political power to fight what they see are problematic concerns of GATT, of freer trade, of reducing tariffs or not using tariffs in XYZ ways. The only hiccup between this point and Trump happens in the early 1970s. So let's talk about the early 1970s. We had an economic recession in the United States. We had high inflation. It might sound familiar for you all today. We had high inflation. We had growing trade deficits. We basically had economic calamity of one sort or the other. Nixon's president, and Nixon instituted what he called the new economic policy. And Nixon did a few different things. He was the president who finally decoupled the dollar from the gold standard. And when I say collapse of Bretton Woods was the agreement to peg the US dollar to the gold. And that was one of the things Nixon did, but for the purposes of our conversation, tariffs, through the new economic policy, Nixon imposed a 10% across the board tariff, which, by the way, it's amazing. I try to read everything I can, New York Times, whatever, right? I don't see much talk of this Nixon tariff when there's discussion of Trump and tariffs. Nixon is the first president to unilaterally impose tariffs like this. Now, he says he has the authority under the Smoot-Hawley and Trade Expansion Authority Act, which is hogwash. It's not in there. And if you Google this, by the way, or look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia will tell you that Nixon did this under the Trading with Enemy Act. That's wrong. It's where you go to the internet and you believe the internet. And the internet's not right. Nixon, in his proclamation in issuing the tariff, cites these two laws. Again, the laws are bogus, right? It doesn't authorize this. Certainly not sweeping across the board tariffs. So because it's legally dubious, we get into the courts. There's a judicial challenge. The lawsuit happens in the courts, and I kid you not, and if I said this without having some proof, you would think I'm crazy. But this is a quote coming from the Court of Customs and Patent Appeals. And basically what the court says is, all right, you guys are right. This Smoot-Hawley Act, the Trade Expansion Act, doesn't give the president this authority. But you know what does? This thing over here from 1917, the Trading with Enemy Act does. And yeah, the Trading with Enemy Act doesn't expressly give tariff authority to the president, but you know what? Congress delegated this, seeded the field, so we're just going to give it to you. I kid you not. That's basically what the quote says. Congress did not specify that the president could use a surcharge in a national emergency, having left the battlefield. It would hardly do to dictate all the weapons to be used in the fight. Again, that's an exact quote from the court case, authorizing this measure under the Trading with Enemy Act. Now, it's legally sanctioned by the courts. All's fine and good. Nope, just like Smoot-Hawley, this didn't fix the problem. Nixon rescinded the tariff shortly after, 1972. So it was not an economic fixer of sorts. Now, This move pissed off Congress. Among other things Nixon did, right? Nixon and Congress, they weren't exchanging birthday cards or presents. This, among other things, pissed off Congress. And so Congress, right, begins to impeach Nixon, obviously Watergate. Don't want to get into all that, but the downfall of Nixon, he resigns. Congress enacts the War Powers Resolution, right? Budget Impoundment Control Act, a number of other things. What Congress also does is it starts looking at emergency powers because of this situation, right? Because the Trading with Enemy Act was delegated emergency powers during World War I. And there were a lot of these emergency powers hanging around since the early 20th century. And Congress actually holds congressional hearings and does an audit and goes, oh crap, like the president has a lot of authority and really unchecked authority. We need to do something about this because, you know, even though we're pretty darn sure there's never going to be a Nixon-type president in the White House, and there'll be rational actors always in the White House, we want to make sure that there are checks. And so the way that they did this is they passed the National Emergencies Act. Basically, for all intents and purposes, this put guardrails around the president's exercise of emergency powers. The other act is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Say that 3 times fast. That law basically split, bifurcated the powers of the Trading with Enemy Act. So the Trading with Enemy Act stayed, but it became a wartime measure. And peacetime, presidents could use this and impose economic sanctions on foreign countries. Now, Congress didn't just bifurcate and call it a day. What they did is they grounded in both legislations a significant check, and that was the legislative veto. So the first president to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was Jimmy Carter against Iran. So let's say, and this happened, right? Jimmy Carter imposed economic sanctions against Iran. Let's say Congress said, you know, the concurrent resolution going to the president to be signed or vetoed. This is a significant check. However, within a few short years, and here's where the courts come back again, you have the Supreme Court case, INS versus Chadha, where they said, you know those legislative vetoes that you use as a stopgap when you delegate a tremendous amount of presidential power? That's unconstitutional, which meant that this significant amount of authority given, and I'm talking, this is tremendous amount of authority packed in here. There's no stopgap measure. There's no stopgap measure like the legislative veto. So that concurrent resolution turns into a joint resolution. And the joint resolution, in order to go in effect, has to be presented to the president. So let's say Congress disapproves that or the overall authority. Congress has to write a law saying, we're wiping away your power. Tell me how many presidents are going to sign such a law. They're going to veto it, which requires a supermajority to overcome the presidential veto. And that's likely not to happen. So this is by and large the state of affairs when we get to the Trump administration, right? And this is built on what I consider to be 3 primary factors. One is the president's use of unilateral action, dating all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, right? The growth of presidential power that way. 2 is judicial reinforcement or confirmation of power. And everything, like I said, Curtis Wright, the customs opinion, INS versus Chadha, all of these court cases reinforcing the growth of presidential power. Last but not least, it's the congressional delegation of authority. You combine all 3 of those factors, which I've been trying to weave into a nice little narrative, you get the modern presidency, particularly as it relates to tariffs and presidential power. Now, let's talk, and I'm not going to belabor this point because we're talking much about it, because frankly, everything that's going on right now makes my head spin. So I'm not going to count all the tariffs or anything like that, but let's talk about the asymmetric issues at play here. What I think makes Trump different. Because basically, if you look at where the modern presidency is grounded when it comes to trade and tariffs, it's in the 1970s. That's when everything comes to like full bloom with the powers presidents can have confirmed by the judiciary. Why from the 1970s up until the Trump administration did we not have this chaos? Well, I would say there's a couple reasons for this. And the first is unique to Trump, is that we haven't had a modern presidency under this post-World War II consensus or construct who believes in tariffs as an inherently good policy tool. Basically is a better policy tool than trade agreements, right? Not seeing any downside, and I would say kind of a sub-element of this, we pretty much have a protectionist type president. And we haven't had really a pure protectionist type president. And I'm not talking Nixon, I'm not talking Hoover. You probably have to go back to William McKinley. But even William McKinley, and we all know because we've heard about in the newspaper, William McKinley's tariffs, he pulled back on tariffs. He saw the problems of just using tariffs as full-blown, right, as a policy-making tool. And so, but Trump, right, he goes against the grain of these post-World War II presidents when it comes to this. So that's one thing. The other, frankly, makes him unique for all presidents. I've been racking my brain over the last week or two to think of a president that is like Trump in this regard. And I can't, because U.S. diplomatic policy over the course of U.S. history, we're talking George Washington, starting with Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, all the way up till Trump, is built on diplomacy, negotiation, compromise. It's not based on bullying, authoritarian tendencies. It is based on strategic leveraging of U.S. resources and commitment in the world and building alliances, not short-term gratification over some particular narrow policy issue, right? Like reducing the tariff rate, getting rid of subsidy. It is built on the longer-term framework, the arc. Trump is the only president I can think of that wants to act first and see what the actions bring, right? So impose the tariffs across the board, have the countries come in and kiss the ring, so to speak. And I can't think of a president that functions this way. U.S. foreign policy, diplomatic policy, has never been this way. Certainly not in trade, and particularly certainly not since the post-World War II consensus. So when you combine what I mentioned before, which is the symmetric buildup of presidential power, particularly related to tariffs trade, with the asymmetric tendencies, you're seeing the warts, the fundamental warts that were under the surface coming to the surface under the Trump administration. And the other factor that comes into play here, and I would raise this first if Trump was only imposing tariffs on China, but that's not the case. But even without Trump, China is a problem for the U.S., right? It is a emerging, not only is it emerging, it's a superpower. It's a significant economy, trumping the United States in different, no pun intended there, different metrics. It's basically a foreign country that needs to be dealt with in a variety of different ways. And I don't mean necessarily an aggressive way, but it needs to be addressed. And as a result of that, it's not just Trump, but prior administrations, Obama, Bush, have been trying to figure out how the U.S. recalibrates itself in this new kind of world order that China is bringing. And so as a result of that, I do see China coming in as a factor, but not as much because obviously, as I said, if only Trump was dealing with China. And by the way, this is so significant, and it's going to be long lasting after Trump, I'll just use the example. Trump imposed tariffs on China in the first term, not like they are now, but the Biden administration ratified them, right? Continued them. And this is part of the reason, is there going any back? I'm not going to answer this fully, and I'll stop in just a second, but this is part of the reason why the Democrats in particular just don't have that adequate of a policy response. Because what they want to do is they want to preserve the modern presidency that has been building up since the 1930s. For a Democrat to come in office, they don't want to take away all this tariff authority and all this. They want the structures that are in place that have served the United States so well. But then they see this threat, and in effect they're treating Trump as an anomaly, which maybe he is, but if he isn't, then they have to do something else, and they don't quite know what to do. So, for example, H.R. 407 is a legislative measure that looks to amend the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to basically strip the tariff authority away from the president, because Trump is the first president to ever use that authority to issue a tariff. And he's used that authority to create the sweeping across the board of tariffs, right? And if you change that language, then you can't create those tariffs. And then there's other ones like this one. And there's, in the short term, because of unified government, Congress is controlled by Republicans. Obviously, Trump is a Republican. His left flank is protected. Thune in the Senate, Johnson in the House have both said any of these measures, they're not going to see the light of day on the floor. So as a result of this, at least in the short term, there isn't necessarily going to be any kind of going back. Maybe with the congressional incoming midterm elections, return to divided government, maybe there might be a change. But even that, it would take legislative action, a supermajority to overcome a veto that would likely happen under Trump. So I couldn't end this on a positive note, unfortunately. Things are a little bit too fluid, and frankly, what I'm ending with is relatively in the short term, we're in the status quo, right? Trump's in the driver's seat. There isn't much Congress is going to do or is able to do. So I'll end it there, and I'll thank you all for coming, and happy to answer any questions, take comments, conversation. Yes, please.
You started this whole talk defining China as the enemy.
I didn't really need it to be the enemy, but I think that's the way.
Yeah, but hear me out.
Yeah.
Corporate greed is why China produces 50% of all of our goods. China owns thousands of acres of our land. They own thousands of buildings, real estate here. We allow that to happen. They own trillions of debt, So we allow that to happen. I shouldn't say we, because I didn't choose it, but the government allowed that to happen, and then they want to be mad at China. I ain't mad at China for doing what's best for China.
Yeah.
I might not like what it's doing to me, but I just don't understand how those people in Washington try to pretend they give a damn about us, because they made those decisions and allowed all that to happen.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, right? If Congress could go back 40, 50 years, maybe. Obviously, the policy of engagement, right, that started under Nixon in terms of acknowledging Red China, so to speak, began us on a course of trying to bring China into what it was considered, what I've been calling the post-World War II consensus kind of world order. And I don't think we anticipated what had happened, right, when it comes to manufacturing going over, and obviously these companies. I don't have an answer. They saw this happening. And again, this is the average politician, lawmaker in Congress, and every single president through Trump, they had the mindset of this post-World War II consensus, which is, again, no trade barriers, or let's get rid of them, right? NAFTA, yada, yada. And the ascending U.S. economy protected against any of the flips. But now that we're seeing a weakening U.S. economy, we're seeing people out of jobs, inflation, I think these things are coming to the center. Obviously, the Great Recession. The Great Recession brought about Trump, and it brought about Bernie Sanders. Now, Trumpism isn't the populism that a lot of people thought it was going to be when, right, that it's but Trumpism is a result of kind of the economic calamity that you're talking about, and we still haven't, within the Republican or Democratic parties, really have had an honest conversation about any of that. And until we do, we're not going to come up with an effective policy solution, whether it's for trade, whether it's for jobs, so on. We seem to be working on the edges. I mean, just the other day I saw our Senator Slotkin. One of her policy solution is to ban Chinese cars, calling them a national security threat. And it's a very, I wouldn't want to say myopic, but I don't want to necessarily say it's not as serious, but it's certainly not a primary driver of the solution that's going to address the U.S.'s economic woes, and certainly U.S.'s relation with China. Putting us on an antagonistic footing with China is probably a loser. And the reason for that is China is becoming stronger and stronger, and China is the U.S., what the U.S. was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so China is the top dog. The U.S. is no longer, or at least it's going to be.
Currency is going to be put out in the world market in a minute.
No, thank you for that.
It's kind of on topic, kind of off topic. Do you think we'll see with Trump more isolationism, and they will kind of spin it as national security? Kind of like what Senator Slotkin was saying, this is I don't think that's, in favor of national security to ban Chinese cars. I think it's more to try and cut them out.
Protect U.S. industry.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what we have writ large, right? Trump, his first batch of executive orders was putting the U.S. on the war footing when it comes to immigration, right? Calling immigration what's happening an invasion, marshaling up the U.S. armed forces. So those are isolationist kind of policies, instead of going with the free border, trying to build a border wall. That's where Trump went in the first term as far as he could go. And then when Congress said, nope, we're not going to build a wall, Trump declares a national emergency and reappropriates money to build a wall. So, past action kind of indicates where the president's, exactly. So I don't see, now that doesn't mean it can't happen. We've seen President Trump issue these tariffs and pull them back right as a reprieve. Yeah. And could that happen tomorrow? Certainly could. I mean, China has indicated today it's willing to engage, but it is what I said in terms of what makes Trump kind of unique than other modern presidents. He doesn't really compromise and negotiate that well, so I'm not quite sure what the engagement's going to look like. So, yeah.
Have we ever seen anything like the reaction we've seen outside the U.S. to new tariff policy here? I'm thinking of, in recent weeks, the Canadian reaction, where there's been a shift of 25 to 30 points in polling, not just because of tariffs, but heavily linked to tariffs. Yes. And even their fundamental decisions of how the new prime minister comes not to the United States, but goes to London, goes to Paris, begins to talk about a whole new approach to trade. Is there anything in Smoot-Hawley or other periods where an aggressive American pivot in trade triggers this kind of, not just in Canada, but fundamental shifts in the way other countries view the United States, or even think about their trade relationships?
I can't think of anything at the top of my head except for obviously the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact. I mean, but that's, again, it's not friends, right? We're talking adversaries, so no, it's relatively unprecedented, but there could be that I'm just not aware of. But you point to something that I really didn't have time to get to, but yeah, there's these indications that countries are looking to other places, not the U.S.'s direction, and that's really the post-World War II consensus. The U.S. was not only setting the policy direction, but the U.S. was, right, the first one out and was the leader of the pack, so to speak. And I think that's profound, and now we'll see what the long-term implications are of Trump not just attacking China, but attacking long-standing friends in Mexico, Europe, you name it. Yes, way back.
I just wanted to know if these tariffs, stay in effect, what it's going to do to the American dollar, the value of the American dollar.
Well, I'm not an economist, so we have economists in the room. Maybe he has a rosy picture of what's going to happen. I just told my wife to go and buy more coffee. She was asking if the tariffs are going to impact coffee. I was like, buy more. You got thoughts on that, Blair?
On the exchange rate?
Yeah.
Typically with tariffs, what you see is an appreciation of, what you would expect is an appreciation of the dollar. But what we've seen recently is the opposite. The dollar has been weakening, and that's because there are some other forces in effect, which is, at least people are speculating that because of an immediate collapse in the reliability of the U.S. as a partner, but also a collapse in confidence, overall confidence in the U.S. economy, people are pulling capital out. And when people pull capital out, of course, they get their dollars, and then they sell their dollars. As they invested overseas, the dollar falls. So what we're seeing right now is, I would say, very bad news. If this explanation holds.
All right, well, that wasn't the positive. I was expecting some positivity there.
So these changes in tariffs are all, made today, announced today. Is there, if there were a change in mindset or in people or whatever, will they be able to change things back as quickly? In terms of, are there elements of this that become entrenched, aside from the behavior and the reputation piece, but I don't know that stuff very well. I just know that sometimes when you do things, undoing them can take a lot longer, even just purely in terms of the rules and the process.
Yeah, and I think that's where you're seeing a lot of these legislative proposals not talking about undoing the entire regime, working on the edges, and I think that's a smarter way of going. So as I mentioned, Trump is the first president to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that was passed in the late 70s. First president to use it to issue tariffs. And because of the unprecedented nature, you could see something like this being passed that doesn't give the president such sweeping power. Because if this is taken away, then the president really has only those four tariff justifications, ability to create tariffs, right? One, national security, right? And Trump has used that. I mentioned the automobiles. And the reason he was able to use that as quickly as he did, it usually takes a long time. And the reason he was able to use it is because he actually requested the Secretary of Commerce to come up with a report to see if the automobile imports were a national security threat in his first term. So that report came out in his first term. I don't know if anybody remembers this. Trump was talking about automobile tariffs back then. And there was this controversy. Congress was like, I want to see the report. You had Senator Grassley, who's a Republican. You had other senators like Pat Toomey, who is a Republican no longer in office, senator from Pennsylvania. And you had other Republican senators too, besides those two, asking the Trump administration to see the report. They wouldn't release it. When Biden got into office, they released it. They looked at it and they basically said, well, this report's hogwash. There's no national security threat. I actually read the summary and then I went into the full report. I tend to agree. I'm not an expert on any of this, but there seemed to be a lot of make-weight stuff. What it reminded me of is the national security intelligence reports that were coming out after 9/11 that the George W. Bush administration were doing. There was a lot of flowery language, but with little meat under it. So window dressing without a great window. And that was the congressional pushback back then, but obviously Trump comes in and unilaterally acts. But he would have to, there's some checks there, like the report normally, yada, yada. And you could see, again, something like this, or something like Grassley Cantwell's talking about, which I see it as kind of grafting onto tariff authority, war powers resolution type deals, but we all know how successful the war powers resolution. We know wars don't start unless Congress authorizes them now, right? I'm being facetious. Yeah, Paul.
So, thank you very much for this sharing this information and this background context. So, when you and I had talked before, when we were talking about this presentation, we were talking a little bit about what, some of Trump's real motivations might be. These are some of what my ideas were. I'm going to ask you to sort of respond to them. First of all, political scientists, economists often assume that people are rational actors. I'm a sociologist. We don't make that assumption. Right. People are driven by culture and ideology and all sorts of other things that aren't necessarily rational. But let's assume for a second that what Trump's doing is rational. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't really hold up because the two sort of typical rationales for tariffs, one is protecting industries, the other is raising revenue, don't really seem to make any sense. And they've offered varying justifications at different times, depending on who's talking, right? And in either case, does the data seem to suggest that they'll work for either one of those things? So then I ask the question, well, what's the real purpose of using the tariff power, other than the fact that Donald Trump really likes tariffs and has for a long time, which is, I think, part of it. Yeah. He's got a belief, a deep down belief that tariffs work in a kind of a magical thinking kind of way, in my view. But the other thing is, to me, it gets back to that power piece, because we haven't talked much about taxation. We started out, we talked about this being taxable and taxation, but tax power is one of the most powerful authorities that the government has, which is reserved to the Congress. The president cannot unilaterally impose taxes, to my understanding. Tariffs don't promise to replace income taxes, but I think there's been raised this idea, there's two things. So this is what I'm asking you to respond to. There's also an agenda in this administration to lower income taxes and possibly to get rid of income taxes. Trump made one comment where he said, well, it'd be great if we could replace the income tax entirely with tariffs, right? If you think about the other reason for that is if tariffs are something that the president can unilaterally control and can use then to get different things out of different people, that puts a tremendous amount of power over the revenue, which of course the revenue power is also the other power that President Trump is now exerting over universities, for example. And anybody that doesn't want to do what Trump wants to, even though these revenues have been allocated by Congress, the president doesn't have authority over them in terms of the Constitution. So to me, that gets back to this issue of is this really fundamentally about power, not about these other sort of policy goals that may be attached to tariffs.
And there's the market manipulation.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's kind of almost like a side quest.
It's like a side quest of a game.
Well, I guess that doesn't really amount to a question, but I mean, I don't really have a clear question in that. But what's your thinking on that? What would be the real? Well, maybe address that first question about the reasons why the tariffs being imposed now don't really seem to bear out in terms of the stated reasons for tariffs, revenues or protecting industry.
I mean, he's claiming, right, reciprocity with the, what was it called? The Liberation Day?
Liberation.
Yeah, when I heard that, I just was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go back underneath the rock. It makes my head spin a bit, and to try to rationalize it. I think a lot of it boils down less to power, more to ego, right? This is a person who likes to get his ego stroked. He likes people coming to him, flattering them, and you tend to see this. And I have students in my class, so we saw this in some of the readings that we were assessing Trump's first term administration, where there were people who would come to Trump, right, and kind of flatter him and appease him in that way, and then he would change, right, change his position. And White House staff would do this, so would members of Congress. And I do think there's something to be said about this ego part of Trump. He's almost like a big man-child that way, authoritarian man-child. And so the whole idea of trying to rationalize what Trump, I can't rationalize it at all, because again, you had Mnuchin in his first term sitting there, basically the smartest people in the Trump administration, the people that have a lot of letters at the end of their name, right, last name, telling them this, and this is bad, and him ignoring, like coming out with charts, graphs, reports. Trump doesn't read any of that. Heck, he doesn't even read the presidential daily briefing, which is a summarized version of the stuff presidents need to know, right? He's not that type of learner. He likes to watch TV a lot, so he's watching Fox News. I'm sorry.
He wants those presidents to each come, to him and ask for, a break.
Yeah. It does feel, so I will give credit here. No, take you just 1 second. So I will say this. The Trump 2.0 administration is much more sophisticated than Trump 1.0.
That's true.
Right? So there is plans, there are policy objectives, there are tactics behind those policy objectives. So it's not completely ego and chaos. You can see underlining plans, and I've mentioned this with my class. We've talked about the unitary executive theory and the discrete actions that the Trump administration has taken there. And then if you want to kind of paint a much more strategic brush when it comes to the push for isolationism, yada yada, you can take tariffs, you can take immigration as just two of those things that kind of are pushing in that direction. Now, Trump also exhibits what we're seeing, what we saw in his first term, which is the kind of chaos when it comes to the White House was the first term. I think a lot of that has to do with the chief of staff, creating a better organization structure than he did have in the first term. Obviously, experience comes into play. He was president. A lot of his White House staff who were not experienced have the first term experience. So a lot of that can contribute to it. But clearly he had a plan. He knew, well, at least he expected to be president. He didn't expect when he was running against Hillary to become president, which is why he handed off any kind of transition planning to his former rival, Chris Christie, so on and so forth. So, yes.
I just had a quick question. Before he started all the tariffs, he was saying like all the other countries were charging too much. But I never saw what the other countries were charging. And I'd like to see what were they charging and what are we charging now. And then he kind of takes it, he draws it back and says, I'm going to give you a 90-day pause. And then he kind of attacks China, then China attacks him, and it kind of goes back and forth. And I don't kind of know where this is going. And then the isolationists, that he's kind of doing. At first he's like, it's United States against all the world. And I'm like, that's not where we want to be. And then when I think about the United States, it was built on immigrants. And then if you start taking, say, yesterday we was talking about the homegrown, we're going to send you to another country without any type of due process. And that could, and when you think about it, that could be your mother, your cousin, your uncle. Any one of us. And in trying to separate us, because we're all just human, and I can't stand all of this separatism. Like, this is my brother, you're my brother. I love culture. Culture to me is beautiful. I like diversity. I would hate for us all to be the same. And this is like, well, why do we have to always separate? And then I think about Israel, like in 1948, how the Palestinians in Gaza, they let them come into their country. And they had a two-state type of a setup. And then over time, Israel just wants to take it over. And I know sometimes we think of the Bible as being Israel, being there all the time, but it wasn't set up until like 1946, 47, 48. And why can't we all just get along? I'm sorry.
I like that. That's a good slogan. So, I would say to
Well,
answer your first question.
Why, what was the other countries charging us?
So-
Why? And if you separate it down, because there are costs, what's gonna happen when the costs come up? What are the other countries asking for?
And this is the problem with the current conversation. The focus is so much on tariffs. And I was trying to, in kind of talking about the symmetric issues and getting to focusing on U.S. policy. U.S. policy, starting in 1934, wasn't on focusing on like a one-for-one on tariffs. It was reducing trade barriers. And trade barriers are more than just tariffs. So the idea of trade agreements needing to be the focus, and really where the Trump administration seems to be, is this focus on tariffs. And it's much more complex than that. As I mentioned, trade agreements aren't about like the US reducing just its tariffs, this other country that we're signing an agreement with reducing only its tariffs. There's a lot more going on, right? As I mentioned, subsidies, yada, yada. It creates a complexity. So you might have in one of these trade agreements a reduction of tariffs rates, but then you might not have it on the other side. It could be something else. So there's this mix, a grab bag of stuff that happens, and that happens because of negotiating compromise. And this focus on one metric to get us a win, or to get Trump a win, I think it's not only policy-wise dangerous, and I'm not an economist, but I'll tell you, politically it's very dangerous. Because you're not going to win on this tit for tat, not in international politics. I mean, even if you can win in the short term, it destroys alliances, as you had indicated, right? People are running, countries are running to try to formulate a different kind of group, and not necessarily the United States as the North Star. But I don't have an answer in terms of how we get out of that. I wish we could all get along. And maybe the answer is, well, Trump is...
Natural born American citizens.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is researching that right now, how he can deport people who've been in this country for 5 generations.
Well, one of the first batch of executive orders tried to redefine citizenship.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
weird.
I'm scared to leave the country. They might not let me back in.
Yeah, I have a political science conference in Canada in September. I might not be coming back. I'll try to be remotely.
Yeah, so Trump is omnipresent in your presentation, but it seems to me that the essence of your presentation is something else, which is system architecture. How do we
Speak up,
build system architecture? In other words, a governance system. So as a sort of a non-expert and a distant observer, it seems to me that Congress delegating power, particularly in terms of trade, since this is what we're discussing, to the executive, has made the system a little more flexible, a little faster, right? But also a little riskier, right?
Exactly.
And so my question to you here is, is the system, the way in which it's designed right now, in need of repair, or are we facing now circumstances that are so extreme that a more rigid system, right, that not even a more rigid system would make sense, right? In other words, flip the question on its head and say, if we had a more rigid system, perhaps we would have a system where Trump would do less damage. However, having that system for 5, 6, 7 decades, right, a more rigid system would have done a lot more damage, right, cumulative damage, right, not just over a term or two, having a more rigid system. So where do we stand in terms of this continuum between a very flexible system, a very rigid system? So where are we in that continuum?
My prescription would be a retooling. And the reason for that is I think the drawbacks of rigidity, we can't know, but I think they're profound, right? And if we go back to the 19th century system, which is a relatively conservative system, right? The strict structures and processes and tools to be used and a level of inflexibility, it could not adapt, certainly, to really the modern day. It couldn't even adapt to how it was 70 years ago, right? You're talking 1940s, 1950s as we saw it. So a sudden shift would have profound implications, not only for policy, but politics. And I think there is a sweet spot to retool. So as I mentioned, some of the things that are being proposed, I think they have, in the short term, they're not going to work. But I think in the long term, they might help retool. Now, the thing that we can't anticipate, and which I said is one of the third pillars to this equation, which is the courts. The courts have been the best friend to the executive branch and the presidency. Every time that Congress has tried to retool, and remember, Congress retooled in the 1970s in answer to Watergate. It retooled to create legitimate heavy checks, but still give the flexibility, right, through legislative veto. And what does the Supreme Court do? It holds that that's unconstitutional in 83. And if something like one of these proposals happens, I can't guarantee you that you won't have a Supreme Court decision that points to U.S. versus Curtis Wright, the sole organ doctrine, and says, you know what? The president, just like they said about a year ago, the president can't be criminally prosecuted. The president can't be hamstringed because of tariffs, despite the fact that tariffs are an Article 1 authority of Congress, right? And that's owes a lot to a conservative revolution that happened over the last 40 years. And I've talked to at least one of my classes about this. And it is the Warren Court era had a profound impact on conservative politics and conservative intellectual thought. And anybody who knows the Warren Court era, it's named after Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court back in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. So you had such decisions as Roe v. Wade, Brown v. Board of Education under this person, Warren, and the court. The reaction to it not only happened politically, but it happened legally. So the politics you saw, there was rise of conservative interest groups, rise of conservative politicians. The legal aspect of it starts in the law schools. You have conservative organizations, particularly the Federalist Society, that what it did was it built a crop of the next legal thinkers, or next law school graduates, who these law school graduates not only become lawyers, they would become judges and fill the federal courts. So 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices have an affiliation with the Federalist Society. 6 of the 9. There isn't any more profound success in recent modern politics than that. Because what the conservatives saw is substantively, not through the democratic process, but through the judicial process, liberals were able to rewrite the Constitution and rewrite policy. We're going to get on top of that. We're going to do that. And so you see this, and you see the success. I mean, just in the course of what? How long has it been? A year and a half? Dobbs' decision. Getting rid of Roe v. Wade. That doesn't happen without the Federalist Society, without a long-term planning to get us there. And so the courts, at this point, are not a neutral arbiter, if you will. The courts are certainly pressing their thumb on the scale when it comes to presidential power and when it comes to a certain conception of the law. And that's because, frankly, liberals, the Democratic Party, were sleeping at the wheel, and they were resting on their laurels and really focusing on, well, let's try to get this politician out or that. When the conservatives were looking at the long-term game when it comes to a third branch of government that reinforces their conception of governance through greater presidential power. So, I don't know how I got onto that, and it's probably not a positive move, but.
You mentioned earlier the unitary executive theory, or the C for the central. Can you just define what that is, and is that also closely associated with this conservative revolution, legal revolution?
It is very closely associated. It's closely associated with Republican presidents in this presidency. So the unitary executive theory believes that the president is the chief executive officer, the sole, right? We don't have a plural executive, is at the apex of a hierarchical system. And the president has top-down command control over the entire executive branch, which it sounds nice. It somewhat makes kind of intuitive sense, but it's complete hogwash. It goes against history, it goes against tradition. And
Doesn't it also go against conservative values? Originalism, so-called originalism, constitutional originalism?
it does, which is why conservatives, for a good part of the 20th century, were kind of against the rise of presidential power. The flip happened in the 1970s, and conservatives said, hey, look, this presidency thing, we can use it to promote conservative values, like attacking communism. Yes?
Oh, I think the absurdity of the situation can be illustrated by a question I'd like to put to you.
Sure. Go
About-
Lions, by the way.
Yeah. How is it that General Motors, for the last 4 years, has been able to produce an entry-level electric car into the Chinese market for about $5,000 American dollars, but can't produce an entry-level electric car in the American market? Does that have anything to do with a famous economist from the 19th century who said that capital always flies to the place where it can make the most money? And why is it that nobody has sued and gotten rid of Trump for violation of the emollients clause? Because he telegraphs all his moves on tariffs to his friends through social media so that they can make more money. It seems to me that we're morphing from a kleptocracy into fascism.
Good question. Is the economist Milton Friedman? No? Yeah.
It was Karl Marx.
Oh, wow, okay. That 19th century, okay. Well, to answer your second thought or question, Trump was sued, right, in the first administration. Currently, what he's doing, I assume there's going to be a lawsuit. We've heard some murmurings around this, right, him profiting, yada, yada, signaling. So I think there's going to be a lawsuit that this is a constitutional violation. Will it go anywhere? I'm doubtful on that. The lawsuits in the first term didn't go anywhere, but I certainly could see a lawsuit happening and a challengeable action. The first part around GM and cars, again, I'm not an economist and I don't know the particulars when it comes to the car GM's making in China, but I mean, a lot of it has to do, China has cheap labor, cheap manufacturing costs, and the U.S. doesn't. And it's a lot of the reason why manufacturing has kind of left the United States. You have these companies looking elsewhere to make a buck. I mean, as you mentioned, right, the profit, profit, profit. I mean, and that's sort of what we see. And you're not gonna likely see anything but kind of token manufacturing, right? We have Ford negotiated agreement with the unions when it comes to EVs, but the things that are being built here are like peanuts compared to what's built in New Mexico, right? The Mach-E is almost completely built in New Mexico. Why? Because if they had to build it here, it would be a lot more money, but then that actually begs the question why other car companies can do it. But anyways, yes.
Well, you know, this country was founded by rich white landowners. And, you know, the Constitution and all that stuff sounds like it's about everybody, but everybody wasn't included. And I feel like they're just trying to return it to that, where rich white men are the only people with any power. I mean, everything that's being done right now is eliminating everybody who's not a rich white man. Even, I mean, J.D. Vance calls professors the enemy. I mean, here's a man with at least 2 degrees.
Which is why I'm like, should I leave, go to Canada? I'm not sure.
It's just, you know, everything that they're doing.
Don't post
just
this
leads to
video.
that to me.
Yeah, no, your point is well taken, right? I do look at the course of the United States history with a bit of positivity, right? The inclusivity of the vote, trying to address past sins that come from the original founding, right? You know, fighting a civil war, Reconstruction, dealing with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. But yeah, there seems to be a bit of regressing. And the hopes and dreams of the 2016 election, both Democratic voters and Republican voters, which was fundamentally kind of attacking the established order, I don't think those have been realized, right? Bernie Sanders has largely been marginalized in the Democratic Party, though he's out there giving these great speeches with like 30,000 people with AOC, but he was marginalized by the Clinton machine. And then you get with Trump's populism, you get Trump right now, and it's not the realization I think even Republican voters had back in 2016. So, you know, I think that begs the question, kind of what you were saying, Paul, about, you know, what are the motivations and then how do we kind of go from here? And I do think retooling's in order when it comes to government structures. But there's larger conversation in society, because government is only a reflection of society, the community, the electorate. And I think the electorate, it's sick, right? And I don't mean that physically, right, sickness. But there is a sickness. There's a sickness when it comes to the economy. You know, high inflation, jobs, money, right? Community, connections, all of those things come in and it affects, and it's the reason why we have Trumpism, the reason why you can have politicians that divide, the reason why you can get the othering. I think you had mentioned something like othering. And I like that, right? Because it reminds me of Dr. Seuss books, right? And one of the moral things I got from Dr. Seuss books was this whole damage that othering can have. And greatest children's books, I think, out there. But that's what we have right now. Othering set in policy.
I just have a quick question. So you said Alyssa Slotkin is trying to ban EVs?
Well, she proposed she's not trying to go out there herself to do it, but she wants to ban the import of Chinese EVs, not
so
completely.
I actually invest in like a lot of Chinese like EV manufacturers.
Okay.
And one of them is Xiaomi, and I really like their car, but I cannot buy their car in the U.S. So my question is, isn't there already a ban on Chinese EVs? Because I'm pretty sure you can't buy like any EV.
I think you can buy it if you pay enough. I heard that one of the guys, Ford engineers, Ford has one, and they drive it around the Ford test track because they say it's so good, they enjoy driving
Yeah, I
it.
saw the CEO of Ford has one of them.
Yeah,
So-
no, Lear was going to say.
Biden imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese cars. That's reason number one. But actually, even with the 100% tariff, we should have seen, you're right, we should have seen some cars. So I think reason number two is the Chinese have decided to stay out of the U.S. market on their own for now.
For now. Oh, and the BYD was talking about, I don't know if they have yet, built a plant in Mexico. So they're actually setting up the infrastructure for getting their cars out there, not only here, but in Europe. And so I do think that China is very sophisticated, I think, when it comes to the politics, the domestic politics. And we should not discount the level of sophistication that China has. They're not heavy-handed, and they seem to be politically smart and playing the long game. And like this whole nonsense around like we're attacking China because they subsidize an industry, I'm like, seems like that's working for them. They have, not only are they, right, copying technology, right? I mean, a lot of their cars look like, Tesla cars, for instance. They're copying the technology, but they're also just pumping a lot of money into infrastructure, you name it. And that's something we haven't done. I mean, the only reason we have any infrastructure when it comes to EVs is because of a private company, not because of state or federal government. That's only come about because of really a Dieselgate from another fallout from a private company in Volkswagen, right? So the US government, until really recently, has put very little investment into this new technology and stuff, let alone investment around manufacturing, et cetera. So, but yeah, no, good question. So, all right.
I want to stand up. I mean, this has been great. I look at these people rooting their seats. It's 4 o'clock.